Hi there. My name's Laura Dickson and my company is called Partner in Risk. So thanks for coming. I know your time is valuable, so I really appreciate it. I'm also a member of a group of female consultants called ABFAP, and they're a group of consultants across Canada. So we thank you. And today I'm going to be talking about risk assessment. And to do that, I'm going to be talking about the Rana Garment Factory building collapse in Bangladesh. It's easier to talk about risk assessment when you have an example to follow with. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. I will be having a few sections where I'll ask you a question and you can contribute. But if you have a question, feel free to ask it as we go along or put it in the chat. Thanks. Okay, so the agenda for today is to use the Rana Garment Factory case study to develop an understanding of why risk management is important, understand the ISO 31000 standard, and I'll mention a few others as well, but I'll focus on the 31000 standard, and understand why enterprise risk management and its holistic approach is worth understanding, and learn about a risk register. So that would be identifying a risk, understanding the probability and severity, and how we can mitigate these risks. So why is risk management important? Well, risk management can prevent loss of life and injury, and prevent loss of assets, such as buildings, prevent devastation due to natural hazards, and help predict the future. Did you all see the YouTube link that was sent out earlier?
Nope.
No? Okay, there is a YouTube video that I'll show you the link in the sources, and it gives you an overview of what happened in 2013. Basically, in Bangladesh, there was some cracks that were seen in a garment factory, and the inspector saw them. He told the factory owner that the employees had to evacuate, and they did, but the factory owner said that the employees had to come back the next day or they'd lose their jobs. So they came back the next day, and soon after, the building collapsed. So that YouTube video was put together by a photographer and also a lot of the brands, well, the Times, but also you can see, and we'll talk about how some of the brands that manufactured in that factory got together and helped support some of the workers who were injured and help support them because there was not enough money available to pay for their injuries. So do any of you know a risk definition? What are your thoughts on that?
Consequence multiplied by likelihood.
Yeah, it can be, you know, the two together and maybe not always multiplied, but different formula. Those two together can come up with a sense of where the risk is, often in a matrix. Does anybody else have a definition of risk? I can show you a risk definition from ISO. So ISO defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objects. And then they add a note saying an effect is a deviation from the expected, and it can be positive or negative or both, and can address, create, or result in opportunities and threats. So that's interesting in that they think of it not just the negative, Objectives can have different aspects and categories and can be applied at different levels. Risk can be usually expressed in terms of risk sources, potential events, consequences, and their likelihood. So that's what you were saying, James. So here's a picture of the Rana Garment Factory, and there were over 1,000 deaths and about 2,500 injured. And as I was saying, there were some injuries that were not covered, such as spinal cord injuries, people with paralyzed limbs, kidney malfunctions, and psychological damage, which must have been huge. So the payments that were in workers' compensation at the time did not ensure a lifelong income. So the International Labor Organization became a trustee for the trust fund that was raised, which raised $30 million US. And you can see the different donors. One was the international clothing brand. So some of the brands that, if you watch the video, the labels were found in the debris. So there's Gap, Mango, Zara, a lot of the different stores you see at Chinook Center, and individuals, anonymous donors, and the Bangladesh Ministers Fund. So over 5,000 payments were made, and that was mostly in 2015 and also in 2016. And then the organization disbanded by 2016 once they made the payments. So in order to show you about a risk register, I'd like you to pretend with me that you're a risk consultant, and we're going to pretend it's 2021, which it is, but we were going to pretend our name is Yamini Ahmed. And I picked that name because Yamini is a common female name in Bangladesh, and it means morally correct or right and proper. So we're going to do a risk register the proper way, and we're going to consider reputational risk, operational risk, hazard, strategic, financial risk. And I'm going to give you an overview of what a risk register is. So first of all, in enterprise risk management, it used to be that we looked at just hazard risk, which was mostly insurance risk. You looked at, is there going to be a fire, liability issues, personnel issues, but now we look at 4 quadrants, operational issues, and there could be IT in that. Different companies will put different things in those areas. People risk, different business processes, depending what type of company it is, and then strategic risk, demographics, and financial risk as well. So what are the benefits of a risk register? Well, a business owner can prioritize risks and mitigate them. That's the main thing. And then you can show any board of directors, a creditor, that you've thought about these risks, but most importantly, that you've mitigated these risks. So you've reduced the risk, or you've eliminated the risk and you've planned for it. And so it reduces the unexpected costs from lack of policies or turnover or lack of succession planning or lack of business continuity plans. So for example, right now we're in the middle of COVID, so it'd be a good idea to document the pandemic plans that we have, because they can be reused for other business continuity issues, floods, fires. And also the risk register uses likelihood and consequences scale that is quantifiable. So different people can be on the same page when they analyze a risk register, and it's a cycle. So it's not like you just do it for a meeting. It's not a paper chasing thing. It's something that is meaningful, and it is something that should be taken seriously. And if it's not meaningful, then you need to re-examine the scale that you're using and make sure that it is useful. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the risk register, and then we'll go into detail. So basically the idea is you would identify a risk, then you would rate it pre-mitigation, and I just put in a sample mitigation here, and then you would rate it post-mitigation. So then you'd have a whole list of risks, and the ones that are really high, you know, extreme or catastrophic or high on the right-hand side, those are the ones you're prioritizing. That's it in a nutshell. And I would recommend you do it every 6 months or a year at the least, you know, and then you keep on top of it during the year. If there's a new risk, add it to the risk register within a couple of weeks at a minimum. So that's where we're going with this. So from what I've told you, in the operation area, which arises from people, processes, systems, or controls, I thought of 3 risks, and then I'm going to ask you what you think. And so just to get you started, I said the number 1 risk is risk of unfair labor practices, because I told you about how the Rana Garment Factory in 2013, there were cracks, and I told you what happened. And I said, okay, the risk owner of that would be the VP of HR. And then the other one was low wages resulting in labor unrest, because I know in my reading there's been continual labor unrest, and not just at that time, but ongoing throughout the years. There's been labor unrest because there's been poor wages. Everything I've read $63 US dollars a month to 65, then it was raised to about $95 a month, and that was only for junior workers. And then there was intimidation with people that are union members, as you can see in the next risk, which is risk of sexual abuse. In 2018, at the Conneberry factory, intimidation occurred against union leaders at the factory. A male labor organizer was assaulted, and a female labor organizer was taken to a field and raped. So I put the risk organizer as VP HR. Now I'm interested in your thoughts. Can you let me know if you can identify any other risks that you can think about just from what I've told you so far?
So Laura, as far as operational, whether you're dealing in a factory, I guess, or whether, and I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but I look at, especially in a factory, you have to look at the safety risks, right? Of how people are managing equipment, are they trained, do you have safe equipment? And then the overnight one, do those people have extra pay for their work? You know, like there's always working in the hospital and having that experience for me, there's always extra pay for working on weekends or working nights and stuff like that. So I look at those things as being something that a company would be looking into in order to recruit and keep people to work those night shifts or weekends.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else have any comments?
Well, there would be a risk of strikes.
Yes, for sure. There's been lots of strikes.
Then there's risks of equipment not being properly maintained because people are afraid of saying the wrong thing about issues of safety.
Yeah.
Could go on and on, right?
Oh, yeah, that's for sure. I mean, I think if people are being intimidated, they're not going to speak up if they think the machines aren't being maintained. Yeah. Okay, I will move on unless anyone has anything else to add. No? Okay. All right. And
Sorry, so when you say, sorry, could you go back one slide?
sure.
So operation you define as people, processes, systems, or controls. That seems very wide.
It is very wide. And so when I was doing risks management, I did it for about 10 years, and we would have over 200 risks. So it covered everything. Operations covered HR. It covered very wide things, and it got into procurement. It got into IT. It is extremely wide. And then you can break it down into communications, and I basically did almost every division.
Yeah.
And you know, I think, and even in hindsight, I didn't have business development, and in hindsight, I should have included them because they had risk for bids. They had their own risk area, but that should have been in there too. So yeah, it's very, very wide, and then it's a matter of not having too many risks, because sometimes they overlap each other. So you have to kind of really make sure you don't have duplicates. So unfortunately, there was another fire in 5 months before the Rana Garment Factory, and over 100 people died and 200 were injured. There's actually 2,000 ready-made garment factories in Bangladesh. They call them RMG. There were 4 disasters between 2013 and 2019. In the case of the Tazreen factory, the main road was a mile from the factory, so the emergency vehicles couldn't get to the factory. So this is a bigger issue. You know, you need government involved to have the roads. So I just made a chart of some of the disasters that happened in 2016 and 2019. So 100 people fell ill after inhaling gas from a fertilizer factory. 34 people were killed in a cigarette packaging plant. In 2019, 22 people died due to a fire trapping office workers. And in 2019, 70 people died when a fire ripped through apartments that were also used as chemical warehouses, and they were very old buildings. So my point with that is, when we are acting as Humani as a risk consultant, these issues are still happening in 2021, and there will be some recommendations made in a document near the end, and they basically say that even though there's been some improvements, there still are some issues happening. So then what I did is I looked at the hazard section of the risk register, and I made some suggestions just to get you started, because now what we do is we look at the identification of risks, and then we look at the probability or likelihood and consequences, and we'll talk about that later. And then we look at the mitigation. So I made an attempt at mitigations to tell you a little bit more as well. And then I'd like to hear from you. So in terms of hazards, hazards arise from property liability and personnel loss. So basically the old insurance risks. So as you know, there's risk of building collapse. So obviously there needs to be regular building inspections, and they need to use buildings as they were intended. And then the risk of fire. We've talked about the Tazreen fashion fire and how managers, I didn't mention that managers stored yarn and fabric on the main floor, and this fueled the fire. There are also locked doors and there was no exit, even though there should have been two. So a mitigation, I don't know for sure if there were fire extinguishers, or if they practiced fire drills, but there could have been fire protection sprinklers, and I don't know that for sure. Now there's an organization called Accord, and that is a European organization. And I'll tell you more about that as we go along. And it's made up of some of the brands that were in the garment factory, and they started fire electrical inspections in factories, and they inspected more than 2,000 ready-made factories. So 5 years later, more than 85% of the health and safety and other remediation work initially identified were fixed. However, in 2020, their mandate ended. So it was passed to the Ready-Made Sustainability Council. So as a mitigation, these inspectors need to be independent. The other risk that I identified was that permitting violations for the Rana Garment Factory, the top 2 floors were not properly permitted. So a mitigation would be an anti-bribery policy, and to use a building for intended use. And in this case where we are Ramini, or Yamini, she is building a new building. So it's not a case of an older building being reused. And of course, the last one is that to build a building that is near emergency routes. So I'm interested in your thoughts. What would you say would be mitigations, other mitigations to these risks, or do you see other risks for hazards?
Well, before you go on, I don't want to take you off track because I know you've got some amount of time, but like one of my questions is, how do you assess how much effort to put into a given risk, right? How do you determine that this is a big risk I should look at, whereas this one is something I should leave? In other words, how much effort should you put into any given mitigation when you're still trying to decide whether the risk is real or not?
Well, I would say that if you find that when you we'll go into probability and consequences, but if you find that you're assessing it as extreme or high or catastrophic post mitigation, so even after you've mitigated it, then you probably want to spend more time on it. So, hi Grace. So I would say that that's what we would do. And sometimes we would do special reports on that, and there would be some risks that would remain on the risk sheet for a long time, and they'd get more and more time spent on the mitigations. And so that's your guideline. If it's on your right-hand side and it's still high, and you would have a risk appetite, which is a statement that says what amount of risk you as a business owner are willing to accept. If you're a small business owner and you just are risk adverse and you don't want to have a certain dollar value above which you can handle the risk, and say it's a dollar value that is equivalent to the dollar value of your house, or it's a reputational risk value, that's what you set, then that's how you determine it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's good to hear.
Okay.
Hi, Laura. Hi, group. What I want to ask isn't so much about mitigation, or talk about isn't so much about mitigation, but I have a question whether or not kind of culture of wherever you're doing this have a lot to play with the amount of risk that people are willing to take. I'm surprised that some of the mitigation that you've been able to recommend here, and I wondered if it was very frustrating to try to get the companies or the company to kind of follow through with some of the mitigation. I had once worked, I mean, like I can see this sort of thing, might work in North America and Calgary. I had worked in China, and they just seem to have they put a different value on human life and on safety. They perhaps give some lip service to it. And when you have an American company working in these other countries, they will maybe speak to it, but in terms of getting things done, it's super frustrating. At least it was for me.
I think those are really valid points. And first of all, this is just a scenario. And when I was doing my sort of practice run of this talk, I made a comment about that especially my mitigation on anti-bribery policy, because I acknowledge that I'm coming from sort of a ethnocentric point of view, and it's great to have that, but that we did have some discussion around that different cultures are different, and you have to also be aware of how things are done. This is a hypothetical mitigation, and also ISO, which I'm going to be talking about, is meant to be taken from one, is culturally sensitive in that it is supposed to be able to be moved from one culture to another, one project to another. So it's adaptable that way, but I think your comments are really well taken. Any other comments before I move on? Okay, this is one of the groups. So there's two groups, one Accord, one is called Alliance. So the Accord, like I said, is made up of some of the brands that manufactured in Bangladesh. So these brands were very aware of their reputational risk. And there were 150 Accord factories that were fully remediated. 857 of these factories have completed 90% of the remediations. 97% of the factories removed lockable gates, which could be a problem if there was a fire. And 175 of the factories were made ineligible to be suppliers with the brands. Now, unfortunately, the Accord was no longer able to, their mandate ended in 2020. So they were taken over by the Ready-Made Garment Factory, or Garment Sustainability Council. And they have a different way of doing business, which isn't as transparent. So they also was an anonymous complaint line for structural safety, denial of sick leave for maternity benefits, and gender-based violence and unfair termination. So the hope is that the Ready-Made Garment Sustainability Council will continue some of this good work that the Accord has done. And the other organization, which is North American, is the Bangladesh for Work organization for worker safety, and they represent Walmart, Target, and other member brands, also the Gap and Costco. And they finished in 2018. They now are passed their mandate on to a company or a group called Nearupon. They suspended 178 factories for lack of remediation standards and inspected 714 factories. So Nearupon has a different way of operating. They will, rather than suspending factories, they will not allow a factory to export. They also don't release their compliance information. So it's a little harder to know how things are going. Nearupon is pressured to be part of the MGMEA, which is Bangladesh Manufacturing Exports Association. So that organization is influenced by the factory owners. So there's a little bit of political pressure there. So now I'm going to talk about ISO. There's many risk standards, and ISO is just one of them. So there's value creation and protection. There's 8 different aspects to this, or principles. So integrated means that risk management should be integrated throughout the organization, structured and comprehensive, customized. This gets back to what I was saying to Grace about how it can be customized for any culture or project or organization, and inclusive, meaning that the stakeholders should be included and not at the end of the risk framework, but at the beginning. Also, the risks are dynamic, so they can emerge and fade away. So since I've been doing risk, there's been, well, at the beginning, 2008, we were dealing with the risk of the avian flu, and then came, there was fires, Fort McMurray fires, floods in Calgary, COVID, and then you deal with the best available information, and that's the best that you can do. You can only do with the best information that you have, and then human and cultural factors and continual improvement. And then these are the aspects of leadership and commitment. You design with the context, the interior and exterior organization, a risk policy that is developed by the COO, showing that there is commitment, and the roles that identify who the risk owner is. I used to identify it by a title and a person's name, and when somebody new came to the organization, I would let them know that this was part of their job, because often that's not in the job description and not right before a risk meeting, quite a while in advance. Communication is important. Implementation involved determining the resources and who makes the decisions. Evaluation is the whole risk management framework suitable? Does it work? Does it take too much time? And you keep on evaluating and improving. And I used to at one point I did a survey. I made a major change, put it on SharePoint, and I did a survey after to find out, is this working for you? And listen to feedback. So, and then the integration is that everyone manages risk. It's everybody's responsibility, and it's part of business objectives and strategy. So this slide talks about risk assessment, which includes risk identification, analysis, which is where you get into the likelihood and consequences, and risk evaluation, which supports the decision. And risk treatment talks about the benefits and the costs versus the costs. So James, I think that's what you were getting at, like how much time do you spend on some of the risks? And then monitoring and reviewing, that should happen all the time, not just at the risk meetings, and communicating and consulting, and during the risk treatment and during the whole process, there should be training, risk training as well. Reporting.
Can I offer some thoughts here?
Yes.
As you're speaking, I'm actually looking right now at a couple of papers that were done. I work in the oil and gas industry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at a couple of papers that were done about 10 years ago, and I'm just going back to them 10 years later and beginning to really more appreciate what was done then. And I participated back in that time frame. It was 2008. There's a couple of things I noticed in the paper. One is that the process by which they tried to quantify risk was basically a crystal ball in Excel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they tried to attach ranges to the likelihood and consequences. And when I look at the output of the paper, I'd love to get my hands on that, because it seems to me that whatever numbers popped out, the numbers that went in there didn't seem to go together. It was almost as though something was going on in the background of the spreadsheet that led to numbers on the output side that looked a bit weird. And I do remember back in the day talking about that. And one thing I realized was the people in the room, it sometimes seemed that the wrong people were in the room, or the people weren't in the room long enough.
So they were using crystal ball?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, I can talk about the way that we got to probability and the different ways of getting to that. I'll just move forward on that on that note. Like.
Yep.
So there are different ways. There's different, like crystal ball, and different kinds of statistical ways of approaching things. And I think on larger projects, probably for oil and gas, there would be different methods like that. And I think on a construction projects as well, they would use different methods like that. The way I've done it is we use facilitated meetings with senior staff members, because we would be dealing with over 200 risks. So I would be dealing with things like, what are the chances of a security risk at, say, a workforce housing camp or something like that. But I think when you're dealing with large construction projects or pipelines, things like that, you can get into statistics. And then you might need the engineers, the geologists, things like that. I think plus mathematicians.
Yeah, so could we talk a wee bit about that? The project I was working on at that time, there wasn't very many of those types of projects. And some of the risks we were trying to look at were very uncertain. And there was in some cases, little knowledge about those risks, right? And so my sense in hindsight is that there was an attempt to be quantitative when there was no data to actually quantify.
Well, I'll show you. So that is why you need the data to quantify, or you go by experienced people and get their best estimate. And that is why I mentioned before, is you get the best information available. Or you can go with something like crystal ball or other other systems that can generate that information, but you do need the data. Like if there's claims information, that's great. But if you have small risks like risk, risk of lack of succession planning, what kind of data can you have for that? So the company has to collect the data in the first place. So that's why I would say the qualitative data was the type of data we use in my experience, or industry research, reading other annual reports for your competitive of your competitors. Now, they're not going to tell you everything, but you can at least check that they have that you've covered off their areas, the same areas. You can look at emerging risks, go to industry talks, or the Delphi technique, where experts are brought in and you ask them questions and they put in their answers, and then all those answers are combined and then they're shared back anonymously, and the same question is asked and over until consensus is reached. But I would say if you want a truly quantitative response, you need to get a mathematician involved, and usually you're answering like one or two really large questions with your really high catastrophic risks. I think that you would be choosing a few really high risks or catastrophic risks in that case.
Right. So when we brought our subject matter experts in the room, we had some very good knowledge about very, very specific things. So the analogy I was thinking of is like we had people that could forecast the weather, and we had people that could forecast traffic accidents. But the people that forecast traffic accidents had no idea about the weather, and vice versa. So as there was an attempt to understand our views on risk from our expertise, it was pretty clear that we were very poor at actually understanding each other.
Yeah, well, I mean, if those risks are separate risks, I would have them as separate line items rather than, right? Like with the weather impact and traffic accidents, they would all be separate risks. Correct?
Yeah, so I wasn't so much getting at the risk register and how to properly identify risk. I was more talking about in the process of dialogue,
Yes.
by which we're trying to understand whether that crystal ball output looked sensible or not. It was very difficult.
Yes. And you're right. And I used to have 3-hour meetings over certain risks with vice presidents so that there was discussion. And sometimes we'd only get through 3 risks, so that there was agreement on those. So that there sort of has to be a melding of the minds.
Right. And the other thing, generally speaking, people are very bad at understanding risk. I mean, they constantly do things that are actually inherently risky and think they're safe. And then they constantly do things that are inherently safe and think they're risky, right? And so I've heard of a technique by which you bring the people into the room and you give them some standard questions, and then you assess each person in secret. You assess just how good they are at really understanding how little they know.
Yes. Well, I will go on and show you why we put a definition around every level of consequences. So even though to put some sort of measure around things, because otherwise everybody's on a different place.
Yeah.
Some people think they're risk adverse when they're not, and that'll be actually further on the slides. But here's a matrix and the likelihood and consequences. So you can see how the risks are high on the upper right hand side and lower, and it can be different for every company. You know, it's really should be customized for every company because it's different for every industry. And This is just a sample. So here's the consequence matrix that is a 5x5 matrix. And for example, level 5 here could be a HSE issue where there's a fatality or permanent disability or a financial impact greater than 15% of earnings, or an environmental impact, or perhaps you consider a reputational impact. It depends on the industry. And you can plug different numbers in here. I purposely put low numbers. I thought, okay, we're talking about textiles, so there could be an environmental impact. I didn't put reputational because I thought, you know, it just depends, but reputational might be different in Bangladesh than it would be here. I don't know. And then as you go down, 4 would be serious injury or illness, and 11% to 15% of earnings before taxes. And every company is going to have their own threshold depending on their risk appetite statement. Likelihood chart could be almost certain, greater than 80% could be almost certain, likely 60 to 80%, and down from there. So the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations in March 2020 basically said that things have improved in terms of health and safety, but people are still being sexually harassed in Bangladesh. And Robert Menendez said, as I said in 2013, American consumers will simply not accept clothes stained with the blood of those who made them. And there were a number of recommendations made, and I won't read them all, but ensuring that the ready-made garment and Nearapond organizations maintain the standards of Accord and Alliance, I thought was one of the more important ones. And impartial investigations into sexual and labor right violations was another important one. If you're interested in this article, it gives a really good overview of the whole situation. So to summarize what I've talked about, I've talked about the Rana Garment Factory case study and explained why risk management is important, not just in a case like the Rana Garment Factory, but just as small business owners. It's important for everyone. Understanding the ISO standard, understanding enterprise risk management and its holistic approach, and learning about a risk register and identifying risks, probabilities, severity, and mitigations. These are the sources I've used. This second one is the YouTube link. If anyone's interested in that, I'll just hold it here in case anyone wants to write that down, or if you want to contact me later, I can send it to you. And are there any questions?
Are you going to throw up your contacts on the chat so I can ask you more questions later?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I just actually, if we go to, I can go to the top and my contact is on the front page.
Great.
Let me see here, get back to the front. Yeah. It's Laura at partnerinrisk.ca.
Yeah, I saw you had the last slide showed it. I was just going to do a screen capture of that.
There it is.
Yeah, I can't see that. You'll need to bring it up.
Oh, that's not doing it. Get to the front one there.
Yeah, you probably have to click on that slide.
Can you see that?
Yeah, click on the first one and then we'll be able to see it. Yeah, there
See
you go.
that now?
Perfect.
There you go. took a picture.
Okay, there. Good. Well, I thank you. If there's no questions, I appreciate your time. With it being at 11, I know it cuts into your day, but it's really, I really appreciate it.